Welcome. I'm Amanda Napper from the Niagara branch of the Ontario Genealogical Society. We're glad to have you here at our talk today with Daryl Learn, who's going to talk about the Niagara River runners. When it comes to daredevils in Niagara, we can imagine the barrels riding over the falls or the tightrope walkers above the river. But the temptation of daring extends beyond the falls themselves. The river runners just gives just a small example of some of the brave, bold, and sometimes careless people who dared the Niagara River. From running a paddler's steamer through the rapids, swimming through the whirlpool, and rushing the rapids in a rowboat to a jack of all trades, the acts of these daredevils dramatically changed their lives or ended them. Our presenter, Daryl Learn, was born and raised in Fort Erie. He spent his childhood living near Lake Erie in the Niagara River and exploring the area, coming from, as one family member put it, a long line of talented liars. Daryl learned the art of story from family, who were told stories from memory and history at every chance they had. Daryl studied at Brock University for political sciences with a minor in Great Books Liberal Studies, as well as at Niagara College for tourism management. Daryl worked for the Niagara Parks Commission in their heritage department for 14 years, rising from a student interpreter at Old Fort Erie to a heritage manager at Table Rock House. Currently, Daryl's primary work is being a stay-at-home parent, but he does speaking engagements, and we're glad to have him here tonight. He does lectures, political or public public historical narrations, uh, and more. And then I'm going to point you later to Daryl's LinkedIn page. I'll drop it into the comments if anybody wants to contact him or learn more about him. But Daryl, welcome. We're glad to have you here tonight. Daryl and I talked extensively before we arranged to have him come on here because I actually have an ancestor who he's going to speak about tonight who married into the River Runner family in Niagara. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say tonight, Daryl.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda. And I'm glad to see so many people coming out. A few familiar names, a few I don't. Um, yeah, this is a topic that I absolutely adore. Um, Growing up, hearing stories from the family and hearing stories from history, you learn to appreciate after a while that the greatest stories don't have to be fiction. There's enough real life that becomes so fascinating that it makes fiction almost pale in comparison. In fact, there's some stories I've told where people refuse to believe it could actually happen. It's almost too unbelievable. But reality has that great pull. And
Mhm.
the Niagara has that great pull, which is why I love this topic. So if you'd like, I'll get started on the talk.
Yeah, I'm just going
Um,
to remind everybody first that if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat to me, and we will take them at the end to Daryl. Otherwise, you're good to go, Daryl.
All right. Well, thank you very much again. And again, welcome to everybody. So, as was mentioned, the topic of our discussion today is going to be the river runners. It is a term that I quite like using, not only for my love of alliteration, but when it comes to Niagara, we know the barrel riders, we know the tightrope walkers, we know all about this stuff, but there's so much more that happened at Niagara, from riots that required the militia to be called in, to bombings, to gang wars, to rodeos. So much happened there. But when it comes to the daredevils, the ones who are often overlooked are those who eschewed the falls themselves and looked to the river, recognizing that Niagara's power extended beyond just the drop. It extended throughout the river itself, and in particular through the rapids. Um, so that leads us to our first of several stories. And I love this image. It's a mid 19th century image of Niagara. You could see Table Rock House tucked off to the side. And you can also see, if you look closely, the Maid of the Mist plying her trade down in the waters. And it's with her that our first story begins. So, oh, Hold on, just got to get to jump to the next one. There we go. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. As Amanda mentioned, it is difficult to do both technical work and talking at the same time, but hopefully that's the last of that. So the Maid of the Mist began in 1840s. It was pretty bunker sort of tourism option for people. Take people close to the falls from an angle you can't see normally. I mean, you had other experiences like this, such as Journey Behind the Falls, which, interesting enough, its first experience was actually chains that had been hammered into the walls, like climbing anchors, to allow you to actually climb under the sheet of the falls themselves. Something I would not have done. I would have preferred the tunnel, but that wouldn't come for decades later. But the Maid of the Mist, it was a simple slide paddle, as you can see here, some folks posing with it, and it was owned by a fellow by the name of W.O. Buchanan. Buchanan, though, was a good businessman, and he understood that there was trouble brewing in the 1850s. Tensions in the United States led to political divisions that threatened the tourism industry in Niagara. Prior to the American Civil War, the vast majority of tourists were not day trippers, so to say. Railroad traffic had not gotten to a point where it was reliable enough and cheap enough for people to really travel to see the falls. You either were someone who was local enough or someone who could afford to stay there for some time. And as a result, the vast majority were actually Southern Americans who would come up and rent houses along the gorge and in the towns of Niagara Falls on either side. And then they would, ply themselves in the area as a way to escape the oppressive heat of the South, which, if any of you have been in the American South during the summers, you can understand the want to escape from there. So Buchanan recognized that if the situation persisted in the United States with these divisions, it would be nigh impossible for a lot of the customers from the American South to travel up to Canada over the summer. In fact, the summer of 1859 had been a rather poor year, as many people had refused to travel, fearing that something might spark with the upcoming election, and they could have all sorts of issues happening. Buchanan decided to hedge his bets by selling one of his Maid of the Mist boats, the Maid of the Mist 2, which looked just like this one here. And he sold it to a buyer in Montreal, which is all well and good, but he had to deliver it to Niagara, present-day Niagara on the lake. And therein lies the problem. How do you deliver a side paddle steamer? It's kind of a ship in a bottle. You could disassemble it and transport it, but that was prohibitively expensive. There wasn't a way to haul it up, and so the only other option Buchanan had available to him was that he'd have to find someone who was brave enough, skilled enough, and crazy enough to run it through the rapids themselves, through the whirlpool, and through the Devil's Hole. And this was not going to be easy for whoever did it. So he sought out people who had experience with rapids, and he found a couple gentlemen from out of Quebec who were well versed in traveling down the St. Lawrence. And as a result of traveling down the St. Lawrence, they knew what they had to do. They knew how to deal with the rapids. And he figured, oh, perfect. These gentlemen will come down and take care of it. So he paid to bring them out. He put them up in a hotel. And the next day, they scouted the river. And they promptly returned and told Buchanan, nuts to you, we're going back home. It was too dangerous. The sheer force of the rapids in the first section was a concern. They felt they couldn't control a ship or boat in such an instance. Then, when it gets to the whirlpool, their concern was, would it be powerful enough to even get out of the whirlpool? And then, last but not least, the Devil's Hole rapids, though not as dangerous in the terms of strength as the initial rapids, the upper rapids, they are still extremely dangerous because they are not being in the gorge, or just at the tail end of the gorge, they're not as shallow, like as deep as the other ones. So there's more rock outcroppings. It also narrows considerably, and you also have these little eddies where you have these pockets off to the side, and the swirling water there makes it so that a boat attempting to maneuver down will be pulled in those directions. So in their eyes, it was suicide to attempt to do so, and Buchanan was left in a lurch. So he had to find somebody to do it, and in his desperation, one man stepped forward, Captain Joel Robinson. Yes, sorry. My cat loves when I get talkative, so she's been down here patting at my sides and clawing at me for a bit. So apologies as I indulge her for a moment. Um, so Buchanan uh, had Joel step forward. Now, Joel had a history with the Maid of the Mist too. He was an employee of Buchanan's. He had captained the Maid of the Mist 1 and 2 on hundreds of occasions. He knew the ship inside and out. And to assist him, he was able to get the assistance of James McIntyre and James Jones, a mechanic and an engineer, respectively, to assist him. He had Jones inside the vessel to take care of the engine as they were going in the boiler, and he had McIntyre with him in the wheelhouse. The concern being that it would take two men's strength to control the wheel as they went through, and he had worked with McIntyre before and trusted him in this situation. So this seemed to be sufficient enough for Buchanan, and on June 6, 1861, the voyage began at 3 p.m. And it went poorly very quickly. As the Maid of the Mist took off, she gave a little toot from her steam whistle to signal her way, and she set off. But as she went into the rapids, almost immediately, she was struck by a massive wave that turned the entire boat 90 degrees, and she was swamped. As waves washed over, it knocked the smokestack off, which you can see in this image here. But it not only did that, the force of it blew out the windows on the wheelhouse cupola, and it threw McIntyre off the wheel with such force that he actually broke the wheelhouse, and the next wave took it off completely. So now the two men are exposed to everything, and one of them's on the ground. Robinson was able to gain control of the situation quickly, or at least grab the wheel, and he had to plant a boot on the back of McIntyre, practically stand on him to prevent him from getting washed off. Now, while this is all going on, Jones is underneath. And if you've ever been in a vehicle or a roller coaster with your eyes closed, it's rather disorienting when you can't see what the movements are coming up. And so he is being thrown about and tossed and turned. And he is not afraid to admit that he was terrified in this moment. So as they flew about, the whole thing, like I said, was turned 90 degrees and was wobbling, twisting. And there was a concern from the onlookers that the boat would break up from the sheer force. It would just snap it in two, if they were lucky, two pieces. But Robinson was able to regain enough control that McIntyre was able to assist them, and they were able to continue their way down with a relative amount of control. Now, the speed that they're going down is just over 40 miles per hour by the estimation of onlookers. So about 60, 65 kilometers per hour. That is immensely fast for this boat. That is the fastest she has ever felt the water under her go. And these men are clinging for their lives as they go flying down. Once they reach the whirlpool, oddly enough, it was a calm for them. Yes, they were rotating around, but they were able to regain control. They were able to check on Jones, and they braced themselves for what they viewed as the most dangerous portion. Because, like I said, going into the Devil's Hole, you've got all those eddies. There's one big one right off the bat, which if you're a local and you've gone hiking, you've seen that on the Canadian side. It's terribly dangerous down there. And for a boat, I mean, it's not like the jet boat. We're dealing with a lot less power here. So this is really a dangerous situation, but they were able to hold her steady, to get her through, and the whole journey, by the time they reached Queenston, was 10 minutes. These 10 minutes changed their lives forever. These men never became the same. Jones, um, unable to probably communicate with the men up above until they reached the calm of the whirlpool. He accepted Jesus into his life with great fervor. He became very devout. Some saying that he became a lay minister, others saying a deacon. There's conflicting, but at either rate, the church definitely became a important part of his life after that moment. McIntyre never recovered from the fear, and in his later life, it was said that he had become so terrified that he would not get on board a boat, on board ships, and even when crossing over bridges, it was said that they would have to treat him like a bird and cover his head, because if he knew when they were going over the water, it would send him into fits, which completely reasonable considering what he had been through. But despite how these men responded, Robinson's was by far the most profound and the saddest. Robinson's success was cheered by everybody. He was in newspapers, and like you can see there, he's got his portrait in the corner of these prints, and they were selling these. But according to his wife, when he came home that day, the song that's sung in his eyes was silenced forever. He resigned his position with the Maid of the Mist. He never captained a boat again. And 2 years later, after rapidly deteriorating health, he passed away. His wife declaring that he had died on that cursed river, but it took 2 years for his body to catch up to his soul. So, an unfortunate end, but Robinson's bravery would be remembered for all time by many people. And I mean, as captains go on the Niagara, he did a brave thing, but he did it in a boat. The next captain I'm going to speak of, he did it a little different. So this is Captain Matthew Webb. Captain Matthew Webb is a fascinating fellow if you get a chance to read up on him. By the time that he came to Niagara, he was already a cause célèbre and quite the well-known fellow across Britain and across most of the Western world. He was a swimming champion. He had won life-saving badges, which you could see some of them being worn there. One he won was when he was serving as second mate on the Cunard Line ship Russia. A passenger fell overboard while in the open Atlantic, and without hesitation, he leapt into the Atlantic in attempts to rescue the passenger. Unfortunately, the passenger was not found, but the sheer fact that he, without a rope and without assistance, leapt into the open ocean. You ask any sailor who's been on the open ocean, that is extremely dangerous. And his bravery was noted, and he was awarded 100 pounds and the Stanhope Medal, which was a medal for bravery from the Humane Society in Britain. I mentioned earlier about him being a champion swimmer. I mean, being a champion swimmer and being a hero was already known to him since his childhood. When he was 15, he rescued his younger brother from the Severn when he was struggling and drowning. But his big moment prior to Niagara was in 1875, when he became the first person in the world to swim unassisted across the English Channel. It took him 21 hours and 40 minutes and a distance of 66 kilometers. And if you look at a map of it, it is a zigzag. The reason being is he had to constantly fight the tides, including the last 40 minutes in which the tides were coming out from the French shore. So he had to swim parallel to the shoreline until the tides were coming in. as he would exhaust himself and potentially harm himself otherwise. Now, he was not the first man to swim across the English Channel. There was an American fellow who beat him by 2 months, but the American fellow had an inflatable vest on when he did so. Uh, Webb did not. So Webb is well known. He travels the world. He gives lectures on swimming. He's won all these competitions. He even publishes a book on how to be a great swimmer. But when he heard about Niagara, he decided this could be a big thing for him, because the problem with being a daredevil is you rarely get to live off of one thing. You kind of need to keep going. And I mean, we've seen that, the 15 minutes of fame, although media was slower that back then. So we got 5 years, I imagine. So he needs to cement his position, and he needs to do it in a way similar to crossing the channel. So it has to be swimming. And he looks at Niagara as the challenge for him. So he travels over in 1883, and he starts scouting out locations. He starts trying to raise funds, things like that. And he makes public comments about, oh, this is nothing more than, rivers I swam as a boy in England. Sure, it's big, but I've swam big. Sure, it's fast. I've swam fast. He figured the whole thing could be done easily by a man of his talent. He acknowledged there would be a struggle, but he felt that struggle wouldn't be until he reached the whirlpool. So word traveled very quickly about this man and how he was planning to do this, but not through professional means. The media was kind of daredeviled out by the 1880s. It was starting to fall out of fashion. There were other things going on in the world. There were, with media opening up, you didn't have to have a daredevil here. They could be somewhere else. You could hear about some adventure on another side of the world. This is where you start to see things like Ripley's Believe It or Not start to become more and more popular. The media is able to produce cheap, simple methods of expanding these stories. The necessity of people traveling and paying money to see someone is kind of gone. So Webb had to rely on a whisper campaign, so to say. He spread the word. He worked with local newspapers who might be willing to have a few palms greased. But he wasn't able to get much in the way of investors. So he was going to have to do the thing and then profit off of it. He did receive one offer of $200 should he complete it, which was a fair sum of money, but he was looking much bigger. He was looking to get into the tens of thousands eventually and have this really cement his fame and allow him to live a quiet life afterwards, or as loud as he was willing to have it go. So on July 24th of 1883, he entered the river in a small boat, removed his cloak, showing his swimsuit, waved to the crowds, and then off he goes into the water. And by this point, people had begun to gather along the edge of the gorge. The whisper campaign had worked. He had noticed days beforehand that people would kind of gather close to the edge, just in case someone said he's doing it, and they could all rush to the edge to watch him. So in his mind, already we have success. Now, as I mentioned, he had done a lot of scouting, so he had done his homework, and he had broken down the river into 3 stages, which I had mentioned earlier with Robinson. You have the upper rapids, in which he viewed that when the danger was the force. The amount of water going through there is immense, and it's being channeled into such a narrow position that the water is roiling and broiling and smashing anything on the surface. And that's where he sees his muse. The surface is the danger, not underneath the water. That section is very deep. At its shallowest points, it's maybe 45, 50 feet. That's a huge stretch where he can potentially go underwater and just ride the current and then come up, catch some air, and go back down. And that's pretty sound. It would help him preserve his own strength for the next portions, and would also protect him from the danger of the surface itself. I say about his strength because his second portion, which was the whirlpool, he estimated it would take anywhere from 4 to 6 hours of heavy, strenuous swimming. Now, even for a man as seasoned as Captain Webb, that was going to be the work. That was going to be the moment that would break him if it was going to. And so he felt he really needed to conserve that energy going into this. So that was a he comes down, he goes into the his plan was to go into the whirlpool, do that, and then once he gets in the Devil's Hole, the lower rapids, again he has the same considerations Robinson had. He has concern about the eddies, he has concern about rocks now, and so he wants to stay in the middle as much as possible. But he felt that after the strenuous efforts of the whirlpool, this would be a much lighter affair, and he would be able to easily make it down to Queenston or Lewiston. So this is his plan, and it starts off very well. When he jumps in, he immediately goes under, and he's riding those upper rapids, popping up for air here and there. But that's where the first problem comes. The force of the water is so much that even just the act of poking his head up just to get a breath of air, the water is pushing his entire body out so that he stands on the water, it appears. One onlooker saying he appeared Christ-like in the way that he would stand amidst the waves before being dashed and beaten and thrown back into the water. So every time he was doing this, just wanting to put his face up, his whole body's coming up and he's getting beaten up. That's got to be a bad beating, considering how bad the waves are. And people are talking about hearing him getting beaten up by the waves. He's going through, it seems like he's doing okay because he keeps going, he keeps popping up. And just before he goes into the whirlpool, he pops up, and this is the worst of them. He is slammed in the chest, and the crack from that echoes down the gorge. Crowds gasp, and people cry out in fear, is he dead? But a few moments later, he emerges from the water, and his head bobs up, his arms are up, and they said it looked like he was sizing up his opponent like a prize fighter. You know, he's going in for that kill. And he comes up to the whirlpool, he descends under the water, and that's the last anybody sees him alive. Webb would be found 4 days later off of Queenston. His body was badly mangled, very much bruised and beaten. And doctors did check his body, and the initial belief was that he drowned, as they found a gash on his head. They believed that he had hit a rock and been knocked unconscious or stunned enough that he had drowned as a result. But further investigation led them to discover something horrifying. They found a bump on the back of his neck, and they had actually found that one of his vertebrae had been knocked out of place, over an inch out of place. That sort of injury would have paralyzed his spinal cord beneath that. So their belief is that he was paralyzed, he went under the waters and was drowned that way. But then it leads to something even stranger, because they end up eventually declaring his death not to be strangulate, not to be from my mistake, drowning it, but they declared it to be from being crushed. There wasn't a lot of water in the lungs, not sufficient enough for it to be a declarative drowning. So what they believe happened is the sheer force of the water after getting pulled down in his paralyzed state, that it constricted his body and crushed his body enough that he couldn't have breathed in if he wanted to. His body was unable to function, and as a result of the crushing, he suffocated under the water. And so ends Captain Webb and his attempt to tame Niagara. Now, we have one big one. This is our big one when it comes to talking about the river, because this is a man who did it all. And I should note, of course, they capitalized on it. They showed Webb in a much more brave situation and they were selling these all over the place. His family did not get a penny. He left behind his daughter and I believe a daughter and a wife, if I'm not mistaken. So, and you can see here a church window that was dedicated to him back in Britain. I would like to see that window one day myself. But this is the man you got to talk about when you want to talk about the river. This is the man who was described as the Riverman. This is Red Hill, William Hill Sr. Now, this man, like I said, he did it all. Born in 1888, he was obsessed with it from a young age. Going down there, swimming, bravery, much like Captain Webb was part of his personality. At the age of 9, he won his first award for bravery, and that was for rescuing his little sister from a house fire. So already he is showing a level of bravery and fortitude that many of us would be in awe of. But he continued with this. He began swimming across the Niagara River from the American Falls to the Canadian side, and he would have people time him. His record time was 11 minutes to get across, and he made a little bit of a show out of it. So maybe he might get a little bit of money to go to the bar that night, but it wasn't really a career. He made a career out of other things, including small businesses, saving lives, recovering bodies, because you want that closure. And by the end of his life, Red was responsible for the recovering of 177 bodies out of the river. That's amazing. And how much closure he gave to the people that he was able to go out and recover their loved ones and bring their bodies back for closure to them. He also bears the honor of winning the most life-saving awards from the Canadian government in history. Now, I have read conflicting accounts because some of the accounts include non-federal government. Some of them kind of mix them in together, but he had minimum 11, maximum 27 awards for bravery through his lifetime. I mean, even the lower numbers are staggering. The bravery of this man and his moments. But his moment as a hero in the limelight, his first one came in 1912. So the image we have here is one of the 3D images they used to have with the special glasses for of the it looks almost like penguins in Antarctica, right? But it's the ice bridge that used to form at the base of the falls. And this in itself was a massive attraction. People came from all over to check out the ice bridge. And it was not uncommon for people to set up shops out there. And Red Hill, young man and ambitious that he was with a couple partners, he had a little snack booth set up where they were selling hot drinks and snacks to people out on the ice. While he was doing so, on February 4th of 1912, he felt something he had not felt before while out on the ice, and that was a very deep rumbling shift. But he knew what that meant. Turning to his partners, he announced they need to get out there immediately, and he ran to the Canadian side shouting for people, get off the ice, get off the ice, it's breaking up. And thanks to him doing so, he saved the lives of over 25 people, getting them off the ice this way, including his own life. It was a near run thing, with some people having to jump into the water up to their waist and get pulled out. The shock of the cold being quite a bit for some of the visitors, but some people didn't make it out. Eldridge and Clara Stanton, they were a couple in their 30s from Toronto, who, when they heard the call, believing themselves to be closer to the American side, they turned and ran for the American side. Unfortunately for them, as they reached the American side, the ice broke up, and suddenly what was ice leading to their safety was now a gulf of water. And they froze in fear for a good few seconds before they turned and tried to run back. And poor Clara lost her footing on the ice and fell. In their panic, Eldridge was finding it very difficult to pull his wife back up. She's panicking, and he cries out for help. They were just about 50 feet away from the edge of the ice, the Canadian side, when this happened. Now, most people would just run, but there was a brave soul amongst them by the name of Burl Hickok. Burl Hickok was 17 years old. He was from Cleveland, and he was traveling there with a friend when the ice began to break up. They made it to the Canadian shore. His friend did, but Burl, upon reaching the edge of the ice, just before jumping in, he heard Eldridge's cry for help, and he turned and he ran back to assist. So with the assistance of Hickok, they got Clara up to her feet, and they went running towards the Canadian shore. Unfortunately for them, the ice began to break up to a point that it blocked their way to get off. They were soon stuck on a large piece of ice that began to drift down. The onlookers said that Eldridge and Hickok began to speak with each other. It seemed like they were trying to plan something out. The entire time, Eldridge did not let go of his wife's hand as they tried to figure out what they were going to do with this. They perhaps were hoping that it would shift close enough to assure that they could make a run and jump. As they passed under the first bridge, they saw, though, that the fire and police departments of both sides had rushed out and had hung ropes down from the bridges, the next two bridges coming up. And so this gave them an opportunity to grab onto one of these ropes and pull themselves up. By this point, the ice had broken up to the point that they had separated, the Stantons on one and Hickok on the other. Hickok did get a hold of one of the ropes and began pulling himself up. And when he got about 60 feet up, we're not sure exactly what happened, but probably on account of the cold, his hands let go. And he plummeted down, and he fell between the ice into the water, and he was never seen again. His body would never be recovered. So this left just the Stantons. Now, Eldridge had gotten a rope from the first one, and he had selflessly tried to tie it around his wife. And while successful initially, the rope snapped as soon as tension was put upon it. So when they came to the second rope, the next bridge, he grabbed onto the rope, the second rope, and he began tying around there. But people could see by the way that he was kneeling and the way that he was working, that exhaustion and the cold were making it difficult. And in defeat, they saw him set the rope down as it slipped away. So Clara knelt with him. They embraced each other. And shortly after, a great wave washed over, and they were gone. Red, though he had saved so many lives, he bore it deep within him that he had failed a few. And perhaps this influenced his bravery in future as well. And you can see here one of the last photographs of the Stantons with the Stantons on the right, and you can see Hickok on the left. So a few moments later, they were gone. So like I said, this influenced him greatly to the point that he was first in line for the next moment. So when the war broke out, Red enlisted, and he spent 4 years in the army, in which times he had been decorated for bravery. He had been gassed, and he had been wounded on a couple of occasions. So he had served nobly, survived the war, and he had come home in August of 1918. Literally days after he arrived, an incident came up which required a brave man, and he stepped forward. There had been a scow being pulled by a tug further up the river that had broken free, and with 2 men on board, Gustav Lofberg and Frank Harris. As it drifted down, the 2 men decided they had to do something rather than just go over the falls. So they had opened the bottom and had flooded it. and they had succeeded in grounding the scow about 600 meters above the edge of the falls. However, getting out from there was now going to be an impossibility without outside assistance. The United States Coast Guard actually mounted on top of the Toronto Power Station, which you can see on the side of this image here. They fired out a rope out to them. The idea being is that they could tie off, and they would use a buoy to send out for them to ride back. And this was the hope for them. However, in the firing out, the breeches buoy became extremely tangled in the ropes, and they needed somebody to shimmy out on the rope and untie these knots and these tangles in it. And Red was the first one to step forward. So hand over hand, he made his way out. Now, the image here is not when he first went out. When he first went out, it was past midnight, and it was pitch black. They had rigged up spotlights to try to shine a light on him, but they ran into a difficulty. Well, he ran into a difficulty in that the light conditions weren't very good to try to figure out how to untangle. And I mean, heaven's sakes, we've all tried to fight with knots in broad daylight. Doing so while hanging over rapids that if you slipped and fell into was a certain death, and in the dark, that's really going to put a strain on you. But Red fought through it as best he could until finally, around 3 a.m., he had to give up. And he came back, and he decided to wait out until daylight. So he waited, and at about 8:30 in the morning, he made his way out, which is what we see in this image here, where he's shimmied out, and it took him an hour and a half to fully untangle everything so that they could get the boys out. And they were able to rescue the two men, who all were guaranteed if he had not gotten out there, they surely would have died. And I mean, the scow's still out there, much closer now, thanks to that storm back in, I think it was 2019. And I know it's kind of a monument to Red to have that out there. And I'm hoping with the new work that they're putting into the Toronto Power Station, they have talked about putting in museum displays in there. I really hope, I'm hoping against hope that this story and Red are in there, because you can't look out there and not hear that story. It would be criminal not to have that story told. So his bravery, like I said, was immense to visitors, to tourists, to all of this. But he's also the rescuer and the savior of not just the average Joe, but the daredevil as well. Oh, looks like one of the pictures decided not to load. Well, we'll skip to the next one. So the barrel you're seeing here is Bobby Leach's barrel. Bobby Leach was the second person to go over Niagara Falls. He decided to be, as he put one time, he's going to be the first showman to go over the falls. No, not a knock against Annie Edson Taylor. Annie Edson Taylor, extremely brave, being the first person to go over in a much more rickety barrel, I might add. Fun aside, her last words before going over were, "I think it's leaking." So quite the bravery from her as well. But unfortunately for her, she had gone over for the purposes of highlighting the treatment of unmarried women in society, which she viewed as being crass and cruel. And as a result, her public appearances were not her retelling the story to great applause. It was her sitting on a chair lecturing all the men in the crowd how they should be treating an old woman like her. So you can imagine how well that played to the crowds. And as a result, Bobby saw a great opportunity. So he had prepared his own barrel, a metal contraption. He had really played up the crowds, really amped this up. And in 1911, July 25th, he goes over the falls. Now, he had been smart to prepare ahead of time to make sure somebody would be there to fetch him so that he wouldn't end up going through the rapids as well as the falls. So Red had struck up a friendship with him, one that would last for years. And he went out and he recovered Leach's barrel. He brought it back, and Leach emerged with assistance. Leach had two broken kneecaps and a fractured jaw from his jostling around inside. It took 6 months for him to recover, but in the meantime, Red was spreading the story further and further, and Leach soon was out doing it himself. Um, Leach even opened a pool hall in Niagara Falls, New York, so that he could have his own venue from which to work out of. And people would just go to his hall just because this is Bobby Leach's joint. Um, Leach would attempt multiple times to try to go through the rapids in a barrel, but this didn't really pan out for him. And as a result, his last big try for anything is he attempted to swim the rapids. He tried 3 times in the 1920s and all failed at various points. But in every point, it was Red Hill who swam out and pulled him out. He would have certainly died if not for him. So, unfortunately for Bobby, he didn't have Red with him when he was in New Zealand in 1926, where Bobby Leach slipped on an orange peel, broke his leg, and would die 2 months later from complications from the leg break. Quite the way to go for a man who had conquered the falls itself. But Red carried on Leach's legacy with the barrel that he had gotten from Bobby after his death, and even building his own. He began to run the rapids, but he discovered them. He discovered the dangers firsthand very quickly. He attempted 3 times to go through. His first voyage took 2 minutes to get down to the get all the way down to the whirlpool, but then he was stuck in there for 3 hours before he could break free of the current and finally get going down. And you can see here with the barrel of his own construction, and of course he's a good man at advertising himself. So he's got himself all painted up on the side. He's wearing all of his medals, both his military service and his life-saving medals, and he's also wearing his militia uniform. So he definitely knew how to impress the crowd. And you notice he has the oar. That is because with the times of him getting stuck in the whirlpool, he began bringing an oar with him so he could pull out and attempt to row himself out. In fact, the fact that he needed assistance led him to attempt again. But even with the paddle, he wasn't able to break free of it. And the frustration was beginning to lead to exhaustion. And it seemed like he could be in peril. But luckily for Red, bravery runs through the family. And his 2 sons, William Redhill Jr. was the first one to go out and save the day. He tied a rope around his waist with his brother, Norman, bracing at the shore. Norman was the one in the last barrel, and went out and pulled his dad out of the rapids, which for any of you who know the rapids, don't go in there. Don't try to be brave. But, we're a little late to tell Redhill Jr. not to be brave, but he did it. He went in and he saved his father from this. Red would continue with more adventures. He would have 3 more journeys through the rapids until his death in 1942 at the age of 54. His early death, unlike Robinson, was not the result of fear of the river. He had firmly conquered that, but it was due to complications long-term from him being exposed to gas during the First World War that unfortunately shortened his life. Now, Red's legacy doesn't end there. He had the common sense to name his bravest son and probably his most foolhardy son also Red. So the legacy of Red Hill carried on with his son. Red Jr. attempted the river just like his father, setting out in his own contraption, his own barrel, on July 8th, 1945. And he's kind of bold in his humbleness, but onlookers said that even his father would have shivered in fear at what happened. The barrel that he had constructed was actually so light that in going through the rapids, it was getting thrown out of the air, including one incident where it was slapped between two waves, and onlookers said it went 6 meters into the air before crashing back down. Upon reaching the whirlpool, Red's brothers, concerned for him, Major and Norman, rowed out, grabbed the barrel, brought him to shore, and are like, "You okay? We can stop now." And Red Jr. was admittedly highly disoriented, a little bit dizzy, and badly bruised, but he steadied himself, said, "Nope, we can finish this." And he continued. He was set back off and continued on. He The entire journey took 2.5 hours, and he wasn't alone. He brought with him a wreath. And immediately after landing in Queenston, he stepped out with the wreath and he traveled to the cemetery where his father was buried and laid the wreath at his father's grave. So, in my opinion, an excellent tribute to his father, that he couldn't lay a wreath unless it too had braved Niagara. Now, Red wasn't done with this. He wanted to try this again. He wanted to have another go at this. Disappointed that his brothers had to come out and assist him. So on September 6, 1948, with a heavier barrel, therefore hopefully eliminating the leaps into the air, he set off again. And this one took 4.5 hours, but again, his brothers had to row out as he was caught in the whirlpool again for multiple hours. And he was, again, disappointed. He wanted to finish this thing without the outside assistance, but he seemed to be constantly frustrated again and again. So he eventually made a decision to do something that even his father would have shied away from. And he understood that if he goes down the river again, it's not going to garner. He's already done it twice. His father did it multiple times. They're just like, ho hum, that's what you do. So he decided to raise money and go over the falls themselves. So Red Jr. put together what money he could. He went around hearkening up investors, and much like Captain Webb, he ran into difficulties. Daredevilry had started to fall out of focus, or at least this type of daredevil. I mean, you were moving into the 50s. You wouldn't really have a daredevil time come again until internationally, until like the Evel Knievel era, a decade and a half later, when it would really blossom. So at this point, daredevilry had kind of become a carnival thing. Yeah, go watch a guy drive a motorbike over some bales of hay or something like that. So as a result, people were not willing to invest. People were not willing to work with him, and he had to make cuts. So he built a contraption to go over the falls. Oh, I should mention, here's Junior and Senior after Junior had rescued Senior on one of the occasions. It was noted that Senior would sometimes not wear the tie when he was in the barrel, obviously, but would insist that a tie be brought along so he could be properly photographed. So here we see Junior with the Thing. So the Thing was a contraption that he had made using industrial inner tubes that were inflated. They were bound together with heavy-duty canvas, like the sort of heavy canvas that would have been used in like airplane straps and things like that, and then heavy fishing netting around the outside. His theory being is that this would be light enough that upon going over the falls, he would not fall for the same problems that other barrel riders had, such as George Stadahakis, whose barrel was so heavy that he got caught behind the curtain for 18 hours, in which we don't know if he suffocated or was beaten to death by the inside of the barrel first, but at either rate, it didn't go well. There was also another fellow, a British fellow, who tried to weight his barrel, and when he weighted it by putting an anvil in the bottom, and he strapped his feet to it, with the belief being that he would keep upright, except when he went over, the bottom of the barrel came out and took him with it, his arms remaining inside the barrel. A touch of irony, his tattoo remained, which said Annie. Of course, Annie being the first one to go over the falls. So just a fun little coincidence there. So looking upon the priors and hearing the stories of them, this is what Red Jr. decided to go with. It took 2 hours for him to get to the falls because, due to the lessened popularity, the police kind of would try to interdict you if you pulled this. So he had to be set off at Usher's Creek all the way up in Chippewa. So it took 2 hours before he finally got to the edge of the falls, and he went over the edge. And the crowd watched it go down, bouncing down to the bottom and into the mist. And for 2 minutes, nothing. Everybody was silent. Where is he? Not even a whisper. They said you could have heard someone sneeze from the other side. And the silence would be broken, though, as the inner tubes began to drift out. And it was the anguished scream of Red Jr.'s mother shouting out for him. She was there along with his wife and his 10-year-old daughter, and the three of them stood vigil at Table Rock as search parties led by his brothers searched for him. It took until the next morning before they found him. His body was badly mangled. His legs were shredded, essentially. And he was found drifting by the Maid of the Mist docks and was recovered. And Niagara had finally claimed Red Hill, but it took him a generation to do so. But Red Hill's legacy didn't end there. You think it ended there, but it exists to this day because the public outcry from this was so loud in the aftermath of Red Hill Jr.'s death that the media, people, everybody was declaring this was senseless, foolish, traumatizing. And the outcry was enough that the Premier of Ontario at the time, Leslie Frost, issued a special order to the Niagara Parks Commission, which is still in effect, that all stunting is forbidden on Niagara Parks property. And that order has stood unchallenged except for 2012 when Nick Wallenda did his crossing. So it seems as if the Hill's final legacy was that they were going to do so much, so daring, that the book would have to be closed after them and no one else could follow. Now we have, I've taken up so much of your time. I want to thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about how fascinating this is. I'm going to throw the floor open to questions. Like Amanda said, if you type them to her, she'll relay them to me, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have. And again, thank you so much. This is much more entertaining to do when there's people on the other side of it.
I don't know. I did some of the research myself on the Hills. As I said, they were married into my family. So it's pretty exciting to read the information as well. But
the amount I had to leave out. And I mean, I
yes,
already took up an hour. And
yeah,
I mean,
well,
I
you
could talk
definitely
for
got the
hours upon
highlights,
hours
but
about the Hills.
there was a lot, definitely a lot.
Now,
I
I
haven't had any questions so far, but if you do have some, please type them into the chat. Susie says, thank you. You're an amazing storyteller.
thank you.
And yeah, I mean, just interesting. And another interesting fact is my maiden name is Webb.
Oh,
Not related to Captain Webb as far as I know, but that was
well,
interesting. I hadn't heard
well,
of
a
him.
funny aside, I actually know a fellow through, I do reenacting, and his name is Matthew Webb. So it's actually by remembering him that I'm able to always remember Captain Matthew Webb's name.
That's perfect. Karen wants to know, what was the name of the woman who went over the falls?
The first one was Annie Edson Taylor.
I remember that.
Annie
Yeah.
Edson Taylor, she was in her 60s when she went over. And as I mentioned earlier, she did so with the idea that she was going to bring awareness to the treatment of unmarried women in the West. At that time, once an unmarried woman had kind of gotten to a point where she was going to go into like a retirement, was no longer able to work, they basically were put in spinster homes, which were little better than workhouses or poorhouses. And she felt that society was not giving women enough credit, and that a marriage did not make a good woman. And that worked against her, unfortunately, because when she tried to give her lectures, they were lectures. She just would sit there and give a moral lecture to the crowd, and it never sold very well with the crowd, leading to her manager stealing all of her paperwork and her barrel hiring a woman in her 20s who was much better looking and taking her on tour.
Oh,
She successfully got her barrel back. She got a new manager, and that manager within 2 years did the same thing.
oh boy. That certainly speaks to the need for what she did in the first place, doesn't it?
Yes, yes. I mean, what she fought for was eventually at least partially gained. There's still more to fight for. But she was a proud woman and she was a dignified woman and she wasn't going to let any man tell her otherwise. So good on her.
Isabel says this is less a question about the river runners and more about the boat that Captain Robinson piloted. Was it still seaworthy, and did it have a new career on the lake?
It was still seaworthy. Its post career is it was actually shipped down to Montreal, where it was used briefly as a passenger ferry and as a transportation vessel. So
Interesting.
it didn't have really a glorious history afterwards, but it remained in service. I'm not sure how long, unfortunately, but I mean some boats have quite the long lifespan. But the fact that she survived going through to be seaworthy enough that the only thing that was wrong is they had to replace the smokestack and the cupola around the wheelhouse. Those are the only serious damage to it that was taken by the boat. So
What a story.
amazing work on the part of
Yeah,
Robinson and a combination of skill, strength, and luck.
absolutely. I think that your presentation was so thorough that people are just saying thank you very much. They don't have
I,
any questions. You covered everything.
I'm
So,
pleased with that as well. I just, if I can add one last little story, there was one excellent little remark that I was trying to figure out where I could work it into the talk about Red Hill, and it was a description from one of the authors, a more modern one, who said the hills, if not for the Niagara River, would have been the craziest, gun-totingest, and most radical party-going hillbillies ever to walk a trailer park. God
absolutely.
bless they were next to the river, for if they were anywhere else, they would have been viewed negatively.
Well, truthfully, when they married into my own family, it was a big controversy because
Showman.
they were good Catholics, and the Hills were not Catholic, and yeah, so it was definitely, definitely. I agree with you 100% there. Bob wants to know if anyone's died as a result of falling off the Maid of the Mist over the years.
There have been a few instances of people falling over. I don't know the numbers and the particulars, but I know there have been a few instances of people falling over. Most of them, well back in the day. The modern ships that they use for both the Maid of the Mist and the Hornblowers are extremely well equipped to deal with a situation like that. I actually had a friend who used to work on the Maid of the Mist back in the 90s and the early aughts, and he said that they trained relentlessly on how to properly respond to that. And I mean, they're still used in a Red Hill sense. If there is an incident of somebody going over,
Mm,
they are still used for recovery as well.
yeah, yeah, interesting. All right. Well, thank you, Daryl. I've just got a few announcements before we wrap up. Steve Fulton next month, if you have the opportunity to join us, will guide our audience through a wealth of resources available through our branch on our website, showcasing how these tools can aid in genealogical research and help uncover your family history. It's membership season. It's always membership season. We appreciate your support. We'd love for you to support Niagara Branch specifically. It gives you special access to Niagara specific resources. We can provide volunteer assistance with your genealogical brick walls. You'll also support projects that help to preserve Niagara's heritage and support our ability to continue these webinars, which I find always very fascinating, and I hope you do too. Our master index is now on ancestry.com, so you may find our records on ancestry.com. And if you have full membership, you'll be able to access those records. And as well, our monthly newsletter. If you have not subscribed, I encourage you to do so. Go to niagara.ogs.on.ca and slide down to the bottom, put your email in, and we'll tell you all about the new resources, current research, upcoming webinars, and also events that are happening in the region. And if you are interested in events that are happening in the region, please visit heritageniagara.ca, which is a website supported by the branch that tells you all about the heritage events that are happening in our area, and all of the properties throughout Niagara and the upcoming webinars and in-person events that you can attend. Again, thank you, Daryl, very much. Everybody in the comments is very complimentary of your webinar. And as I said, if you do want to find Daryl after the webinar, he's on LinkedIn. Just type in Daryl Learn. That's how I found him.
There's
So
only two other Daryl Learns in the world, and only one of us is on LinkedIn.
perfect. All right. Well, you guys have a good night, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.